What if I told you that Rome's greatest weapon was not the sword, but the shovel? It was thanks to the shovel that the legions created something that inspired awe throughout the empire, the Roman military camp, or castrum. It was not just a temporary bivouac, but a perfectly tuned mechanism. A fortress city that could spring up in the middle of a hostile desert or dense forest in just a few hours. Life within this perimeter was not subject to the chaos of war, but to an ironclad routine where every cog knew its place. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the Roman army, one that had nothing to do with combat tactics. That secret is unification. Whether set up in foggy Britain, hot Syria, or forested Germany, Roman camps were built according to the same strict blueprint. This had enormous psychological significance for every soldier who spent years away from home. A legionnaire transferred to the other end of the empire found himself in a completely familiar environment. He instinctively knew where the centurion's tent was, where the armory was, and where the main gate was. This predictability created a sense of home and stability amid chaos and uncertainty. No matter what foreign land a legionnaire set foot on, in the evening he returned to an orderly, understandable, and safe world. The camp was a microcosm of Rome, carried with them on the tips of their spears and on their shovels. This standardization was not just a military necessity, but a powerful tool for maintaining morale and discipline. Every element of the camp, from the location of the toilets to the width of the streets, was calculated and approved. Engineers and surveyors known as grammatici were among the most respected people in the legion. They were responsible for accurately recreating the standard plan on any terrain. Their work required a deep knowledge of geometry and topography, as any error in their calculations could disrupt the entire well-oiled machine. This precision and meticulousness distinguished the Roman army from any other army of the time. The camp itself was a symbol of Roman power and unshakable order. Its straight lines, sharp angles, and powerful fortifications demonstrated not only military strength, but also the superiority of Roman civilization. For local tribes accustomed to chaotic settlements, the sight of such a perfect rectangle built in half a day was a demonstration of almost divine power. This was a civilization that had come to stay. This standardization also had enormous practical significance. In case of alarm, every soldier knew exactly where to run and which section of the perimeter to defend. There was no confusion or disorder, both of which were fatal in defense. Every centurion knew the exact location of his cohort, and the commander could instantly assess the situation. The Roman camp was not just a place to sleep, but a continuation of Roman ideology. An ideology of order, efficiency, and total control over space and time. Every ditch, every palisade was a material embodiment of Roman law brought to the wildlands. This was their main secret. 10 rows of tents, separated by straight passages, formed a cohort. 10 such cohorts made up a legion. This mathematical precision permeated all spheres of life. Soldiers lived in a world where everything was subject to numbers and function. This system excluded individuality, but in return gave a sense of belonging to something great and indestructible. A legionnaire was not just a warrior. He was a builder and bearer of this order. Want to know the secret that allowed the legion to disappear in one place and reappear in another in full combat readiness? The answer lies in incredible mobility and engineering training. Every day of the legion's march ended with the construction of a fortified camp. Even if the stop was planned for just one night, thousands of people set to work, turning an empty field into a fortress. But before digging the first shovel into the ground, it was necessary to choose the perfect location. This was a science in itself, carried out by special surveyors, grammatici, or camp measurers. They were sent ahead of the main column with cavalry cover to assess the terrain. The main criterion was access to vital resources. First and foremost, clean water. A river, stream, or at least a place where wells could be easily dug. Without water, the legion could not survive a single day. The second important resource was wood, needed in huge quantities to build palisades, ramparts, towers, gates, and as fuel for cooking and heating. Therefore, they tried to set up camp near a forest. The third factor was topography. The ideal location had natural advantages for defense. Camps were often set up on a hillside, which provided a good view and made it difficult for enemies to approach. They avoided lowlands that could be flooded by rain, as well as places surrounded by dense thicket or high ground from which the camp could be observed. Once the location had been chosen, the Grammatici began marking it out using a special tool called a groma, a cross on a pole with plumb lines, which allowed them to measure perfectly straight angles. First, the central point of the future camp was determined. From this point, two main streets were measured, intersecting at right angles: the Via Principalis, Main Street, and the Via Praetoria, Praetorian Street. Around this intersection, squares were marked out like a template for the headquarters, the commanders' tents, and then the quarters for the cohorts and centuries. All markings were made with poles and colored flags. When the main column of the legion approached, the soldiers already had a marked-out plan waiting for them. They did not need to think about where to pitch their tents or dig a trench. Each centurion led his unit to his assigned sector, and work began immediately. The march itself was no less organized than life in the camp. The legion did not move in a disorderly crowd, but in a strict column. Each soldier carried an impressive load called muli Mariani: personal equipment, tools, stakes for the palisade, and a supply of provisions for several days. The total weight could reach 40 kilograms, carried on a special T-shaped pole called a furca, which allowed the load to be distributed evenly and quickly dropped if necessary. This system made the legion independent of the baggage train on short marches. Discipline on the march was ironclad. Strict distances were maintained, and stops were made only on command. Scouts constantly combed the terrain ahead and on the flanks to prevent the column from encountering unforeseen situations. The Roman legion on the march was a living, moving fortress. Imagine this: a legion of 5,000 men, after an exhausting day's march, weighed down with baggage, arrives at an empty, barely marked field. And in just 3 or 4 hours, a full-fledged fortress stands on that site, surrounded by a moat, a rampart, and a palisade. This incredible speed was achieved through ingenious organization of labor and specialization. As soon as the legionnaires arrived at the site, the work was immediately divided. About 2/3 of the legion, having thrown down their baggage, immediately took up shovels, pickaxes, and axes. The remaining third lined up in full gear to guard the perimeter while their comrades worked. While the moat was being dug, another group of soldiers went to the nearest forest to prepare stakes for the vallum. Each legionnaire carried 2 or 3 sharpened stakes, but for a full camp, thousands were needed. These stakes, tightly set and often intertwined, formed a continuous, impenetrable palisade. Simple but extremely effective, strong enough to withstand a serious attack. The work was carried out at an incredible pace. Every soldier knew exactly what his task was. Centurions and legati supervised the process, ensuring all work followed the plan strictly. While the fortifications were being built, another kind of life was already bustling inside the camp. Soldiers from each contubernium pitched their leather tents, called papiliones. They were set up in strictly designated areas in neat rows forming streets. At the same time, tents for officers and the headquarters tent were erected. The camp gates received special attention. There were 4, one on each side, additionally fortified and often flanked by wooden observation towers. Sometimes a clever defensive system called a clavicula was used to protect the entrance, an internal rounded rampart that forced anyone entering to turn sideways, making them vulnerable. By sunset, the camp was ready. The moat was dug. The rampart was built. The palisade was erected. The tents were pitched. The legion was completely safe. This ability to create a fortress out of nothing, using only muscle power and simple tools, was one of Rome's main tactical advantages. A Roman camp was not just a collection of tents behind a fence, but a carefully planned urban space based on a simple and ingenious grid system, similar to that used in Roman cities, which provided instant orientation and rapid movement of troops. The camp was based on 2 main intersecting streets. The Via Principalis ran across the camp and connected the 2 side gates. It was very wide, allowing troops to be quickly transferred from one flank to another, and the tents of senior officers and tribunes were located along it. Perpendicular to it was the Via Praetoria, which led from the main gate, the the Porta Praetoria, to the center of the camp. It was through this gate that the legion marched out or assembled. The intersection of these two streets formed the central square, where the headquarters, the Principia, was located. Behind the headquarters, on the same axis, was the Via Decumana, leading to the rear gate, the Porta Decumana. This gate was considered the least honorable. Prisoners were usually let out through it, or waste was taken out. The rest of the camp was divided into equal rectangular quarters called strigae, separated by narrow streets parallel to the main ones. In case of alarm, a centuria could assemble and reach its section of the rampart in minutes without any confusion. The legionnaires' tents were arranged in neat rows within these quarters. Each cohort occupied its own quarter, and within it each centuria had its own row. At the end of each row stood the centurion's tent, slightly larger than the soldiers. The commander, looking at the camp plan, could tell exactly where any of the 60 sentries were located. Soldiers lived, ate, and slept as part of their unit, which strengthened cohesion and mutual support. An important feature was a wide open space left between the tents and the inner slope of the rampart, called the intervallum. This space served several functions. It protected the tents from projectiles that could fly over the rampart, served as a ring road for the rapid transfer of reserves to any section of the perimeter, and often housed auxiliary services, field kitchens, latrines, and space for pack animals. This layout transformed 5,000 armed men into a single coordinated organism. Each soldier was part of his 8-man contubernium. The contubernium was part of a centuria. The centuria was part of a cohort, and the cohort was part of a legion. And this entire structure was literally imprinted on the ground in the form of streets and quarters. At the center of every Roman camp, at the intersection of the main streets, was its administrative and spiritual brain, the Principia, or headquarters. It was from here that the legatus commanded the entire legion, and here that its most important symbols were kept. The Principia was a large rectangular complex open to the interior. A monumental entrance led from the Via Principalis into a large open courtyard, surrounded by a colonnade and used for morning roll calls, the distribution of orders, and official ceremonies. Behind the courtyard was the main building of the complex, the Basilica. In the camp, it served as a place for meetings in bad weather and a hall where justice was administered. Along the far wall of the basilica was a row of small rooms, the offices of the camp bureaucracy, where scribes kept track of personnel, compiled lists for the payment of salaries, and recorded the receipt and expenditure of supplies. The Roman army was incredibly bureaucratic. Every nail was accounted for. In the very center of this row of rooms was the most sacred place in the camp, the Cecellum, or sanctuary. Here, under heavy guard, were kept the standards of the legion and its cohorts, including the main eagle, the Aquila. These standards were not just banners, but objects of religious worship, embodying the honor and spirit of the legion. The loss of the eagle was considered the greatest disgrace, so the Sacellum was the most heavily guarded place in the camp. Next to it, often in a basement below, was the legion's treasury, chests containing the soldiers' pay and their personal savings deposited for safekeeping. To the side of the Principia, usually on the right, was the Praetorium, the private residence of the legion commander, the legatus. Even in a temporary camp, it was an impressive structure with several rooms, a private courtyard, and often a small bathhouse. It served not only as a residence for the legatus and his family, but as a place to receive important guests or local leaders. The luxury of the Praetorium was intended to demonstrate the status and wealth of Rome. Here the legatus held military councils with his senior officers, tribunes and the senior centurion, the primus pilus. On the other side of the Principia were the houses of other senior officers, the tribunes, far more comfortable than soldiers' tents, emphasizing the strict hierarchy that pervaded the legion. The center of the camp was its nervous system. All threads of command converged here, decisions were made, money was kept, and the symbols of honor were guarded. The daily life of an ordinary legionnaire rarely intersected with this place, but his entire existence in the camp was guided by the orders that emanated from the Principia. The daily life of an ordinary soldier took place in the smallest unit of the legion, the contubernium, a group of 8 men who lived, ate, worked, and fought together. They were a real army family, and their home was a single leather tent. This tent, known as a papilio. Because its shape resembled butterfly wings, was extremely cramped. 8 fully equipped adult men shared a space of only about 10 square meters. There was no question of privacy. The soldiers slept shoulder to shoulder on straw mattresses or simply on the ground. Tents were set up in rows, with each row housing 1 centuria of 10 contubernia. The space between the tents was minimal, just enough to walk through. Each contubernium was a self-sufficient unit. They had a common pot for cooking, a hand mill for grain, and 1 mule that carried the tent and common equipment on the march. The soldiers took turns caring for the mule, and this shared responsibility united the group. In the morning, the soldiers woke to the sound of a trumpet long before dawn. The first task was to tidy their equipment and tents. Discipline demanded perfect cleanliness. After that, the soldiers received their daily ration of grain, usually unground wheat or barley. The most tedious daily task was grinding it. Each contubernium had its own hand-operated rotary mill, and the soldiers took turns working the heavy millstone to produce coarse flour. This process took time and effort, but it was mandatory. The flour was used to prepare their main meal, most often a thick porridge or soup with water and salt added, and if possible, vegetables, beans, or pieces of bacon. Sometimes bread was baked from the flour. Unleavened, hard army bread known as panis militaris, baked in small clay ovens or on hot stones. Such bread was hard but did not spoil for a long time. Mealtimes were communal. 8 soldiers would sit around a shared pot and eat from their bowls. Moments of shared meals that served as an important part of social life, a time for conversation and news. Living in such cramped conditions required enormous patience. Arguments and conflicts were inevitable, but they were resolved within the group or with the help of the senior member of the tent. The survival of the group depended on the harmony of these 8 men. The Roman legionnaires' diet was based not on luxury but on functionality. Food had to be high in calories, cheap, easy to transport, and long-lasting. The main product that met all these requirements was grain. Frumentum, wheat, barley, or spelt provided soldiers with the carbohydrates needed for long marches and heavy construction work. Roman commanders believed that soldiers who ate grain were more resilient than those who ate large amounts of meat. Meat was considered a supplement, not a staple. In addition to porridge and bread, the diet included other foods. Cheese, usually hard and salty, could be stored for weeks and was an important source of protein. Legumes such as lentils and beans were often added to soup. Vegetables depended on the season and location. Onions, garlic, and cabbage were the most common, valued not only for taste but for their health benefits. Salt was an absolutely essential product, distributed regularly and in sufficient quantities. The legionnaires' main drink was not water but posca, a drink made from water and sour wine or wine vinegar. It was cheap, quenched thirst effectively, and had disinfectant properties due to its acidity, helping maintain hygiene when water sources were uncertain. Supplying the legion with food was a complex logistical task. Each legion had a vast convoy of hundreds of mules and carts transporting grain, wine, and other provisions. During long campaigns, the legion could not rely solely on supplies from Rome. Food was purchased from the local population, either for money or in the form of taxes. When necessary, foraging detachments were sent out in search of grain and livestock. In permanent camps, Castra Stativa, the situation was different. Over time, entire settlements called canabai grew up around them, where merchants, craftsmen, and soldiers' families lived. Here, legionaries could buy more varied food with their pay. Fresh fruit, honey, or even visit a local tavern. Soldiers also tried to diversify their diet themselves. One of the most important and responsible duties in the camp was guard duty, vigilia. The camp never slept. Guard duty was organized with mathematical precision. The entire night was divided into 4 watches, each lasting 3 hours, with new units taking over each watch. Guards were stationed around the entire perimeter of the rampart, on the towers, and at the gates. Inside the camp, patrols maintained order, prevented fires, and ensured that sentries did not fall asleep. There was a complex system of inspections. Every night, cavalry patrols rode around the perimeter checking the vigilance of the sentries. Falling asleep on duty was considered one of the most serious offenses and was severely punished. A key element of security was the password system. Every day, a new password was announced at the Principia, written on a special wooden tablet called a tessera. The tesserarius, the junior officer in each centuria, was responsible for communicating it to his soldiers going on guard duty. Anyone approaching the camp or moving around it at night had to give the correct password. This system was simple but very effective, preventing outsiders from entering and helping to identify spies. The camp gates were an area of particular attention. During the day they were open, but always strongly guarded. At night they were securely locked and barricaded, opened only on the orders of a senior officer. This constant vigilance was not paranoia. It was a necessity. Roman camps were often located in hostile territory, and a sudden attack could occur at any moment. The system of guards and signals turned the camp into a sensitive organism, ready to respond instantly to any threat. A soldier may not have welcomed those cold night hours on the ramparts, but he understood that the lives of his entire contubernum and the entire legion depended on his eyes. The Roman camp was designed as a completely autonomous organism capable of existing in isolation for weeks or even months. To this end, not only residential tents and headquarters were located within its perimeter, but entire production complexes. Not only infantrymen served in the legion. Among the legionnaires were blacksmiths, carpenters, tanners, armorers, and engineers. These specialists, known as immunes, were exempt from certain daily duties, such as digging trenches. In order to focus on their craft, they were highly valued personnel. The workshops were constantly busy. Blacksmiths at field forges repaired tools, shod mules, and straightened bent pieces of armor. Carpenters made tool handles, repaired cartwheels, and built siege engines. Leather workers repaired tents, shoes, and equipment straps. The presence of these workshops allowed the legion to be independent of supplies from Rome. Any breakdown could be repaired on the spot, making the army incredibly flexible and resilient. Another critical facility was the Valetudinarium, or hospital. The Romans understood the importance of hygiene and medical care in maintaining the army's combat readiness. In permanent camps, the Valetudinarium was a large, well-organized stone building. Even in temporary camps, special tents were set aside for it in the quietest part of the camp. The hospital was built in a corridor style, with rows of small wards designed to accommodate several patients, allowing for isolation and cleanliness. In the center of the complex were a courtyard for walking, operating rooms, dressing rooms, and rooms for storing medicines. The hospital was headed by a medicus, the chief physician of the legion, assisted by junior doctors, capsarii, and other staff. Roman military medicine was surprisingly advanced for its time. Doctors could perform fairly complex operations and had a large set of surgical instruments at their disposal. Special attention was paid to prevention. The Valetudinarius was responsible not only for treatment but for general hygiene in the camp, monitoring the quality of water and food, and controlling the cleanliness of latrines and baths. In permanent camps, thermal baths were a mandatory element helping soldiers maintain personal hygiene. Stone channels carried sewage and waste outside the camp, which was a key factor in preventing the spread of disease. The Romans understood the connection between cleanliness and health earlier than many others. The presence of workshops and a hospital transformed the camp from a simple military encampment into a real city, one that could repair itself, treat itself, and provide for itself. Perhaps the most important element that permeated life in the camp was discipline. It was not just a word, but a fundamental concept on which the entire Roman army was built. Without it, there would be no order, no strength, and no victories. Discipline was the invisible framework that transformed a crowd of people into an invincible machine. It was felt in everything, in movements, in speech, in the very bearing of a soldier. Even the gait of a legionnaire had to be measured and confident, as if he were Mars himself. It was not just a requirement, but a way of life. From the very morning, from the moment the bugler announced the rising, everyone knew their task. Discipline filled the day with meaning and order. setting the rhythm for everything, from how a soldier made his straw bed to how he buckled his sword belt. Every step, every action mattered because chaos was the enemy of Roman order. Discipline was the glue that held thousands of people together, forcing them to act as a single organism. When thousands of feet marched in unison, it was not just a march. It was a manifestation of the will of the empire. Even if a legionnaire grew tired, he knew his comrade was walking beside him, and that to stop would be to let the formation down. This is how the spirit of unity was formed, without which the army would have turned into a helpless gathering. The centurion could notice any negligence. A poorly fastened fibula, a dirty belt, a loose buckle. Everything had to be perfect, because appearance reflected inner readiness. The daily routine was scheduled down to the minute. Rising, inspection, breakfast, formation. Legionnaires had virtually no free time. During their rare hours of rest, soldiers repaired their clothes, cleaned their equipment, or helped their comrades. In the Roman army, idleness was considered the enemy of the spirit and worked the cure for despondency. If a soldier was not busy with construction, on guard duty, or on campaign, he trained. These training sessions, exercitations, were daily exhausting and endless. They developed endurance, strength, and a habit of obedience. Even veterans who had been through dozens of campaigns continued to train, setting an example for the young. Training took place on a special field outside the camp called the campus, a flat area cleared of rocks and bushes. Here, under the scorching sun, soldiers carried out the orders of instructors who knew no mercy. They marched until their feet burned and their breathing became ragged, covering dozens of kilometers in full armor that weighed dozens of kilograms, without complaint. Each step strengthened their bodies and willpower. They learned not only to walk, but to maintain formation, keeping equal intervals and rhythm even on rough terrain. They practiced forming and reforming complex maneuvers, such as the famous testudo or tortoise formation, to the point of automatism. This exercise required absolute harmony between the soldiers, as the life of the entire unit depended on the slightest mistake. Individual skills were also practiced. Soldiers fenced with wooden swords and threw training darts. These training weapons were heavier than real ones, making the exercise more demanding than actual combat. After such training, a real gladius seemed light and the enemy seemed slow. Construction skills were constantly honed as well. Every legionnaire had to be able not only to fight but to build. The legions regularly practiced setting up temporary camps, and competitions were held between centuries to see who could dig their section of the moat or erect the palisade fastest. This turned hard work into competition, developing speed, coordination, and mutual assistance. The moat had to be perfectly straight, the tent stretched without wrinkles, the earthen embankment of uniform height. It was precisely because of such exacting standards that Roman camps always looked perfect, a reflection of the empire itself. Discipline also meant unconditional obedience to orders. The hierarchy in the legion was absolute. The contubernium obeyed its decanus. The decanus obeyed the centurion obeyed the tribune, and the tribune obeyed the legatus. An order given by a superior was not discussed. It was carried out immediately. The centurions were the backbone of the army, experienced soldiers who had risen from the ranks. Everyone knew them by their voice, their gait, and their gaze. A single shout from a centurion could silence 100 men. They were personally responsible for the training, daily life, and morale of their century. The centurion's authority was unquestionable. His word was law. He ate with the same soldiers and slept in the same camp, yet remained above them because he was the example. He could punish, but he could also praise, and such praise was valued more than any award. Even everyday tasks were part of discipline. The daily cleaning of weapons and armor was not just a necessity but a ritual. Every rivet, every plate of armor had to shine. Dirty equipment was considered a disgrace, symbolizing carelessness and weakness of spirit. A dirty tunic or a rusty helmet attracted the immediate attention of the centurion. Punishment for negligence could be severe, from deprivation of rations to public censure. But more often than not, the soldier was ashamed of himself. because letting down the Legion was worse than any punishment. This system of total control and constant activity had a deep psychological meaning. Soldiers had no time for idleness, which could lead to a decline in morale or discontent. Their bodies and minds were constantly occupied with specific, understandable tasks. Discipline did not oppress. It gave confidence, because it brought order to a world in which chaos reigned. Life in the camp was, in essence, endless training. It was a school of endurance, obedience, and patience. Here they learned not only to fight, but to live in the constant rhythm of service. Every day strengthened the body, the spirit, and faith in the Legion. Legionnaires trained in endurance, obedience, coordination, and engineering skills until the last day of their service.